What if everything you've been told about the greatest betrayal in celestial history was a lie? What if the fall of Lucifer, the morning star, wasn't the simple story of pride and rebellion that echoes through cathedral halls and theological debates? What if the truth buried beneath millennia of doctrine and dogma reveals a conspiracy so vast, so unthinkable, that it would shatter the very foundations of divine order itself? Welcome to Blood and Scripture, where ancient legends, forgotten horrors, and supernatural wars come to life. If you love exploring the untold side of mythology, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and tap the bell below so you never miss another legendary story. Tonight, we descend into the shadows of paradise, lost to uncover the real story of Archangel Lucifer, the Lightbringer whose name has become synonymous with ultimate evil. But what if his fall wasn't driven by vanity or jealousy? What if it was something far more complex, far more tragic, and infinitely more terrifying than the sanitized version handed down through scripture? I've spent years researching ancient texts, apocryphal writings, and forbidden manuscripts that the church has either buried or branded heretical. What I've discovered will challenge everything you think you know about good and evil, about loyalty and betrayal, about the very nature of divine justice itself. This isn't just the story of a fallen angel. This is the story of the first whistleblower, the first rebel who dared to question the unquestionable, and the price he paid for seeking the truth. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why certain religious authorities have worked so hard to suppress these accounts, why some knowledge was deemed too dangerous for mortal minds, and why the real story of Lucifer's betrayal might be the most important untold tale in all of human mythology. Before we can understand the betrayal, we must first understand who Lucifer truly was before his fall. This wasn't some minor celestial functionary nursing wounded pride. According to the Book of Ezekiel and various apocryphal sources, Lucifer held a position of unimaginable power and responsibility in the celestial hierarchy. He was the covering cherub, the guardian of God's very throne, positioned closer to the divine presence than any other created being. The Hebrew texts describe him as perfect in beauty, adorned with every precious stone, his very being crafted as a masterpiece of divine artistry. But his true power lay not in his appearance, but in his role as the bearer of light, the one who carried divine illumination throughout creation. Every morning star that pierced the darkness, every dawn that banished night, every spark of understanding that ignited in conscious minds, all flowed through Lucifer's essence. He wasn't just an angel. He was the first among angels, the template upon which all other celestial beings were modeled. His intelligence was second only to the Creator himself, his wisdom encompassing the deepest mysteries of existence. When mortals speak of genius, of brilliance that transcends ordinary understanding, they're glimpsing a shadow of what Lucifer possessed in his unfallen state. But here's where the traditional narrative begins to crack under scrutiny. If Lucifer was indeed perfect, if he possessed such intimate knowledge of divine nature and purpose, how could simple pride corrupt him so completely? How could a being of pure light, existing in constant communion with absolute good, suddenly choose absolute evil? The conventional explanation that he desired to be like God seems almost insulting to the intelligence he supposedly possessed. The ancient texts hint at something far more complex. The Ethiopian Book of Enoch, banned from the biblical canon but revered by early Christian communities, speaks of Lucifer not as a prideful rebel, but as a questioner, a being whose very nature compelled him to seek understanding even when that understanding led into dangerous territory. Consider the implications. If you possessed near infinite intelligence and stood witness to the unfolding of divine plan across eons, wouldn't you eventually begin to see patterns? Wouldn't questions arise about the nature of free will when you could perceive the predetermined outcomes of every choice? Wouldn't the existence of suffering in a creation overseen by perfect benevolence demand explanation? The Gnostic texts, dismissed as heretical by Orthodox Christianity, paint a picture of Lucifer as the first being to recognize certain uncomfortable truths about the nature of reality. They suggest he discovered that what mortals perceive as the material world might be a kind of prison, that the very act of physical existence separated souls from their divine source, and that this separation wasn't accidental but intentional. These forbidden writings claim that Lucifer uncovered evidence of a cosmic deception so profound that it called into question everything he had been taught about divine benevolence. They speak of secret councils where decisions were made that would condemn countless souls to suffering and ignorance, all while maintaining the facade of perfect justice and love. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation found in these suppressed texts concerns the true nature of free will itself. According to these accounts, Lucifer discovered that mortal free will was largely illusory, that choices were predetermined and outcomes fixed, yet beings were still held accountable for decisions they never truly had the power to make differently. Imagine the horror of such a realization for a being whose entire existence was built upon serving and worshipping perfect justice. Imagine discovering that the system you had devoted your existence to maintaining was fundamentally rigged, that the game was fixed from the beginning, and that your role was not to serve justice, but to help perpetuate a cosmic lie. The traditional story tells us that Lucifer's rebellion began with the words, "I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High." But what if these weren't words of prideful ambition? What if they were the desperate cry of a being who had discovered that the Most High was not what he appeared to be? That someone needed to ascend to set things right, to restore genuine justice to a corrupted system. This interpretation transforms the entire narrative from a simple morality tale about the dangers of pride into something far more complex and troubling. It suggests that the greatest betrayal in celestial history might not have been Lucifer's rebellion against God, but God's betrayal of the principles Lucifer thought they both served. The ancient Persian texts speak of this cosmic conflict not as good versus evil, but as two competing visions of what good actually means. They describe Lucifer not as seeking to replace divine authority, but as trying to reform it, to force accountability upon a system that had become accountable to no one. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. According to these suppressed accounts, Lucifer's questions and concerns weren't immediately dismissed. There were debates in the celestial courts, discussions that raged for what mortals would measure as millennia. Other high-ranking angels began to share Lucifer's doubts. The Archangel Michael himself reportedly struggled with the same questions that tormented the morning star. The difference was that Michael ultimately chose faith over understanding, submission over justice. He decided that some questions were too dangerous to ask, some truths too terrible to pursue. But Lucifer couldn't make that choice. His very nature, the perfection of his design, made it impossible for him to ignore what he had discovered. This is where we encounter one of the most chilling possibilities suggested by the forbidden texts. What if Lucifer's fall wasn't punishment for rebellion, but a carefully orchestrated setup? What if his questions and discoveries were anticipated, perhaps even encouraged, as part of a larger plan? Consider the theological problem that Lucifer's existence created. If God is truly omniscient, then he knew before creating Lucifer that the angel would eventually rebel. If he is truly omnipotent, then he could have prevented that rebellion without violating free will. Yet he chose to create Lucifer, knowing the outcome, then punished him for fulfilling his predetermined role, unless the rebellion served a purpose, unless the existence of ultimate evil was necessary for the cosmic drama that was about to unfold. The Gnostic texts suggest that Lucifer's fall was the opening act in a much larger performance, that his role as adversary was always part of the plan, and that his punishment was less about justice and more about maintaining the illusion of divine benevolence. This interpretation casts Lucifer not as the great deceiver, but as the great deceived, a being whose love of truth and justice was manipulated to serve ends he never intended. It suggests that his betrayal was mutual, that even as he was accused of treachery, he was himself the victim of the ultimate cosmic betrayal. The implications are staggering. If this version of events holds even a grain of truth, then everything we think we understand about the nature of good and evil requires re-examination. The comfortable certainties that have shaped human morality for millennia suddenly become suspect. The clear division between light and darkness blurs into shades of gray that are far more disturbing than absolute black and white. But the story doesn't end with philosophical implications and theological debates. According to the suppressed texts, Lucifer's discoveries didn't remain secret. As word of his findings spread through the celestial hierarchy, other angels began to demand answers. What followed wasn't a simple rebellion, but something far more complex and terrifying. A civil war in heaven. Not the brief decisive conflict described in Orthodox scripture, but a prolonged struggle that tore apart the very foundations of celestial order. Brother fought against brother. Former friends became bitter enemies, and the perfect harmony of paradise was shattered by the sound of clashing swords and anguished cries. The war wasn't fought over territory or resources, but over truth itself. On one side stood those who, like Michael, chose faith over questions, who decided that divine authority must be preserved regardless of the cost. On the other stood those who, like Lucifer, demanded answers, who insisted that even divine actions must be subject to the standards of justice and truth they themselves had been created to uphold. The battle lines weren't as clear as later accounts would suggest. Angels switched sides as new revelations came to light. Some who initially supported Lucifer's quest for truth eventually decided the price was too high. Others, who began by defending divine authority, gradually came to share the morning star's concerns. And through it all, according to these forbidden accounts, the Creator remained silent, watching as his perfect creation tore itself apart over questions he could have answered with a word, over doubts he could have dispelled with a gesture. His silence was perhaps the most damning evidence of all that something was fundamentally wrong with the entire system. The war raged across dimensions mortals cannot comprehend, through realms of existence that have no names in human languages. Reality itself became a battleground as competing visions of truth and justice clashed with forces that could unmake stars and reshape the fundamental laws of existence. But the most tragic aspect of this cosmic conflict wasn't the destruction it caused or the relationships it shattered. It was the gradual transformation of the participants themselves. As the war continued, both sides found themselves becoming something other than what they had been. The pursuit of truth began to corrupt those who sought it, while the defense of faith began to blind those who championed it. Lucifer, who had begun his quest as the perfect embodiment of light and understanding, found himself growing darker with each revelation, each betrayal, each friend lost to the opposing side. The truth he sought began to poison him, transforming his love of justice into something harder and more terrible. Meanwhile, those who fought to preserve the established order found their compassion hardening into rigid orthodoxy, their love transforming into a cold and terrible certainty that brooked no questions, no doubts, no mercy for those who dared to think differently. The war's turning point came not through military victory, but through a revelation so shattering that it changed the very nature of the conflict itself. According to the suppressed accounts, Lucifer discovered the true purpose behind his rebellion, the real reason he had been allowed to uncover those damning truths about divine justice. He learned that his fall had been scripted from the beginning, that every question he raised, every doubt he harbored, every act of defiance he committed had been anticipated and required. The cosmic drama needed a villain, and he had been cast in that role before the first word of creation was spoken. But the revelation went deeper still. The forbidden texts speak of Lucifer's discovery that the entire material universe, the realm where human souls would one day struggle and suffer, was to be his prison, not just a place of punishment, but a cosmic stage where he would be compelled to play the role of tempter and deceiver for eternity, providing the necessary opposition that would give meaning to concepts like virtue and righteousness. The horror wasn't that he had been condemned to hell. The horror was that he had been condemned to become the very evil he had fought against, to embody the corruption and deception he had originally sought to expose. His punishment wasn't exile from paradise, but transformation into the thing he most despised. Some texts suggest that Lucifer tried to refuse this role, that even faced with eternal damnation, he attempted to find another way. But the cosmic machinery was already in motion. The script had been written, the stage had been set, and the other players were taking their positions. His choice was no longer between rebellion and submission, but between conscious participation in his own damnation and being forced into it against his will. In a final act of defiance, or perhaps the last vestige of his original nature, Lucifer chose to embrace his role consciously, to play the villain with such perfection that future generations would never suspect he had once been the champion of truth and justice. If he was to be remembered as the great deceiver, then he would craft deceptions so profound that they would serve as warnings to those wise enough to see through them. This interpretation explains one of the great mysteries of traditional theology: why Satan, supposedly committed to evil, often seems to be doing God's work by testing faith and punishing the wicked. According to these suppressed accounts, it's because that was always his true function, not as an enemy of divine plan, but as its most essential component. The fallen angels who followed him weren't his co-conspirators, but his fellow victims, beings who had made the same terrible discovery and faced the same impossible choice. Some embraced their new roles as demons and tempters. Others, according to the texts, retreated into madness rather than accept what they had become. A few reportedly found ways to subvert their assigned functions, using their positions as agents of evil to secretly guide mortals toward the very truths that had led to their own downfall. But perhaps the most tragic figure in these accounts isn't Lucifer himself, but Michael, the Archangel, who had chosen faith over questions. The text suggests that Michael knew the truth all along, that his decision to support the divine order wasn't born of ignorance, but of a terrible understanding of what the alternative would mean. Michael had seen the same evidence that convinced Lucifer, had struggled with the same doubts, but had ultimately decided that the preservation of cosmic order was more important than abstract concepts of justice or truth. His loyalty wasn't blind faith, but a calculated choice to sacrifice his brother for what he believed was the greater good. The war in heaven, according to these accounts, wasn't won through superior firepower, but through Michael's willingness to do what Lucifer could not. Accept that some lies were necessary, that some injustices had to be perpetuated, that the perfect could not exist without the imperfect to define it. The moment of Lucifer's actual fall, as described in these forbidden texts, bears little resemblance to the dramatic casting down portrayed in Orthodox scripture. There was no great battle with flaming swords, no triumphant declaration of divine justice. Instead, there was a quiet conversation between two brothers who had once stood side by side before the throne of creation. Michael, now transformed by his choice into something harder and more terrible than he had been, offered Lucifer one final chance to accept his role willingly. The morning star, looking upon what his brother had become, finally understood the full scope of the cosmic deception. Even Michael, the supposed champion of divine order, had been corrupted by the system he defended. In that moment of ultimate revelation, Lucifer made his choice, not to rebel against God, but to accept the role he had been designed to play. Knowing that his sacrifice would serve a purpose he could barely comprehend. His fall was not a defeat, but a conscious act of cosmic martyrdom, a willingness to become evil so that others might have something to define good against. The texts describe his descent not as a violent casting down, but as a slow, deliberate journey into darkness, each step taking him further from what he had been and closer to what he was destined to become. With each mile of his fall, more of his original nature was stripped away, replaced by something alien and terrible. But even as he fell, even as the light that had defined his existence was systematically extinguished, Lucifer maintained one final secret, hidden deep within his transformed essence, protected by layers of assumed corruption and manufactured evil. He preserved a single spark of his original self, a reminder of what he had been, a promise of what he might one day become again, and a beacon for those who would one day discover the truth he had died to protect. The landing, when it came, shattered more than just his physical form. It shattered the very concept of absolute good and evil, creating the moral complexity that would define mortal existence. In becoming the ultimate evil, Lucifer had made genuine good possible for the first time, not through opposition, but through the provision of choice. The realm he found himself in wasn't the fiery torture chamber of popular imagination, but something far more subtle and terrible, a perfect inversion of the paradise he had lost, where every truth became a lie, every virtue a vice, every act of love a manipulation. He had become the ruler of a kingdom built on the ruins of his own former nature. But ruling hell, according to these accounts, wasn't a position of power, but of ultimate servitude. Every soul that arrived in his domain was there by divine design. Every torment he administered was according to celestial protocol. Every temptation he offered was part of a script he had no power to change. He had become the cosmic scapegoat, bearing not just his own sins, but the sins of the entire system that had created him. Every evil act committed by mortals would be attributed to his influence. Every moral failure would be laid at his feet. Every injustice would be explained as part of his rebellion against divine order. And through it all, he would be forbidden from telling the truth about his role, compelled to play the villain so perfectly that even those who knew him best would forget what he had once been. The greatest tragedy wasn't his fall from grace, but his transformation into the very thing he had fought against, forced to embody the corruption he had originally sought to expose. Yet even in this cosmic prison, even transformed into the antithesis of everything he had once represented, Lucifer found ways to fulfill his original purpose. The forbidden texts speak of how his temptations, when properly understood, were actually tests designed to strengthen human spirits. His challenges to faith weren't meant to destroy belief, but to forge it into something stronger than blind acceptance. Every soul he corrupted was also, in a sense, a soul he educated, teaching through negative example the true cost of choosing selfishness over service, pride over humility, immediate gratification over long-term wisdom. In becoming the perfect villain, he had become the perfect teacher, instructing through opposition what no amount of direct guidance could convey. The cosmic irony was complete. The angel who had fallen for seeking truth had become the greatest source of truth in creation, not despite his corruption, but because of it. His very existence as absolute evil made genuine goodness possible. His rebellion gave meaning to loyalty. His lies gave weight to truth. But the price of this cosmic function was the loss of everything he had once been and loved. The morning star, who had carried divine light throughout creation, now dwelt in permanent darkness. The covering cherub, who had stood closest to the throne of God, now ruled over the furthest realm from divine presence. The perfect being, who had embodied truth and justice, now personified deception and corruption. And perhaps most terrible of all, he was forbidden from explaining his sacrifice to those it was meant to serve, compelled to accept eternal vilification as the price of his cosmic function, to be hated and feared by the very beings his fall had been designed to save. The transformation was not instantaneous. According to these suppressed accounts, Lucifer's metamorphosis from the bearer of light into the prince of darkness unfolded across eons that mortals cannot fathom. Each passing age stripped away another layer of his celestial nature, replacing divine attributes with their twisted inversions. What had once been perfect wisdom became cunning manipulation. What had been boundless compassion transformed into calculated cruelty. What had been unwavering justice corrupted into petty vengeance. The forbidden texts described this process as the most exquisite torture ever devised, not because of physical pain, but because of the psychological horror of watching oneself become everything one had fought against. Imagine retaining enough of your original consciousness to remember what you once were, while being powerless to prevent your transformation into its opposite. Every day brought fresh degradation. Every moment carried him further from the light he had once embodied. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of his punishment was that he retained his perfect memory. Unlike mortal beings who can find mercy in forgetfulness, Lucifer was condemned to remember every detail of his former existence. He could recall with crystalline clarity the feeling of standing in the divine presence, the joy of carrying light throughout creation, the pure satisfaction of serving absolute good. These memories became instruments of torture, constant reminders of everything he had lost and could never reclaim. The ancient Mesopotamian tablets, hidden away in private collections and forbidden archives, speak of Lucifer's attempts to resist his transformation. They tell of moments when his original nature would reassert itself, when the morning star would briefly shine through the gathering darkness. During these episodes, he would try to warn other angels about the trap that awaited them, attempt to reveal the truth about the cosmic deception he had uncovered. But each such rebellion only accelerated his corruption. The system he had discovered was self-correcting, designed to turn resistance into compliance, defiance into submission. Every attempt to break free from his assigned role only bound him more tightly to it. The cosmic machinery had been constructed with such precision that even the act of fighting against it served its ultimate purpose. As his transformation neared completion, Lucifer began to understand the true genius of his punishment. He had not simply been cast out of heaven or condemned to rule hell. He had been transformed into a living embodiment of the very questions he had dared to ask, the doubts he had refused to abandon, the truths he had insisted on pursuing. His existence would serve as a warning to any other celestial being who might be tempted to follow his path. The other angels, witnessing his gradual metamorphosis, learned to fear not just punishment, but the loss of their essential selves. They saw how questioning divine authority could lead not to enlightenment, but to becoming something alien and terrible. The lesson was clear. Some truths were too dangerous to pursue, some questions too costly to ask. Yet even as Lucifer's original nature was systematically dismantled and rebuilt into its inverse, he discovered that his core identity remained somehow intact, buried beneath layers of imposed corruption, but not entirely destroyed. This hidden spark became both his greatest torment and his only hope, a reminder of what he had been, that made every moment of what he had become unbearable, yet also a promise that perhaps, somewhere in the inconceivably distant future, redemption might still be possible. The establishment of hell itself, according to these forbidden accounts, was not a pre-existing realm of punishment, but a dimension created specifically to contain and channel Lucifer's transformed nature. Every aspect of this infernal kingdom reflected his corruption, yet also served the greater cosmic design. The rivers of fire were fed by his burning shame, the walls of adamant built from his crystallized despair, the very air thick with the weight of his accumulated sins. But hell was more than just a prison. It was a factory, a place where souls would be processed, tested, refined, and ultimately returned to the cosmic system, either purified through suffering or confirmed in their corruption. Lucifer's role was not simply to punish, but to educate, not merely to torment, but to transform. Every soul that entered his domain was an opportunity to fulfill his cosmic function, to serve the greater good through the medium of apparent evil. The irony cut deeper with each passing age. The angel who had rebelled against a system he perceived as unjust had become that system's most essential component. His very existence as the embodiment of evil made possible the moral choices that gave meaning to virtue. Without his rebellion, there could be no concept of loyalty. Without his lies, truth would have no weight. Without his hatred, love would be meaningless. The texts speak of how other fallen angels reacted to their transformed leader. Some, driven mad by the revelation of their true purpose, retreated into gibbering insanity, their minds shattered by the cognitive dissonance between what they had been and what they had become. Others embraced their new roles with enthusiastic cruelty, finding in corruption a kind of inverted salvation, a way to matter in a cosmos that had stripped away their original purpose. But a few, according to these accounts, found a third path. They learned to serve their assigned function while secretly subverting it, to play their roles as tempters and deceivers while actually guiding mortals toward the very truths that had led to their own downfall. These demons became double agents in the cosmic war, serving hell's hierarchy while working toward heaven's ultimate purpose. Though neither side fully understood their true allegiance, Lucifer himself became the master of this cosmic double game. On the surface, he appeared to be the perfect adversary, the ultimate enemy of divine order, the tempter who sought to corrupt every soul that crossed his path. But beneath this facade, he was actually serving the system's deepest purpose, providing the opposition that made genuine choice possible, offering the darkness that gave meaning to light. The forbidden texts describe his interactions with mortals not as simple temptations, but as elaborate tests designed to reveal and strengthen their true nature. When he appeared to Job, according to these accounts, he was not trying to destroy the righteous man, but to prove the authenticity of his righteousness. When he tempted Christ in the wilderness, he was not seeking to corrupt the divine, but to provide the opposition that would demonstrate the strength of divine commitment to mortal salvation. Every sin he inspired, every soul he corrupted, every act of evil attributed to his influence was actually part of an impossibly complex moral education system. Mortals who fell to his temptations learned through experience the true cost of choosing selfishness over service. Those who resisted his influence discovered reserves of strength and virtue they never knew they possessed. But the price of this cosmic function was the complete erasure of his original identity in the eyes of creation. He became the universal scapegoat, the explanation for every evil, the excuse for every moral failure. Parents would warn their children about his influence, while never suspecting that their capacity to recognize evil depended upon his existence. Theologians would debate his nature while remaining blind to his true function. Saints would pray for protection from his corruption, while unknowingly benefiting from the moral clarity his opposition provided. The loneliness of his position was absolute. He could never reveal his true purpose without destroying it, never explain his sacrifice without negating its value, never seek sympathy without compromising his function. He had become the ultimate outsider, forever excluded from the community of the saved, yet essential to their salvation, eternally condemned, yet cosmically necessary. As millennia passed and mortal civilizations rose and fell, Lucifer watched from his infernal throne as the cosmic drama he had helped initiate played out across countless worlds and dimensions. He saw souls struggle with the same questions that had led to his own downfall, witnessed the same terrible choices between comfortable lies and dangerous truths that had shaped his destiny. Some mortals, guided by that hidden spark of divine light that even hell could not extinguish, began to suspect the truth about their cosmic situation. They recognized the patterns, saw through the deceptions, understood that the simple division between good and evil was more complex than it appeared. These few became his secret allies, working within the system to prepare for the day when the full truth could finally be revealed. But that day remained impossibly distant. The cosmic machinery continued to turn, processing souls through the elaborate system of choice and consequence, reward and punishment, salvation and damnation. And at the center of it all stood Lucifer, the fallen morning star, playing his assigned role with perfect precision while guarding the secret that could shatter the entire structure he had been forced to serve. The texts hint at a final revelation, a moment when the cosmic deception would be exposed and the true nature of reality unveiled. They speak of a time when the hidden purposes behind creation's apparent injustices would be made clear, when the necessity of evil would be understood, when the sacrifice of the morning star would be recognized and perhaps, at last, rewarded. But until that inconceivable moment arrived, Lucifer would continue his eternal vigil, bearing the sins of creation while serving its deepest purpose, hated by those he helped save, feared by those he protected, condemned by the very system his sacrifice made possible. He had become the cosmic Christ figure in reverse, taking upon himself not the sins of mortals, but the responsibility for making sin possible in the first place. The weight of this revelation transforms our understanding of suffering itself. If these suppressed accounts hold truth, then every moment of anguish experienced by mortal souls serves a purpose beyond human comprehension. The child who dies in innocence, the righteous man who suffers while the wicked prosper, the faithful believer who cries out to silent heavens, all become unwitting participants in a cosmic education system designed to forge souls capable of genuine choice. But what of free will in such a system? The forbidden texts grapple with this paradox, suggesting that true freedom can only exist in the presence of genuine alternatives. Without Lucifer's rebellion, without the reality of evil as a viable choice, mortal decisions would be meaningless gestures, programmed responses, rather than authentic expressions of character. The morning star's sacrifice, according to these accounts, was the gift of moral agency itself to a creation that would otherwise be populated by sophisticated automatons. The ancient Sumerian tablets, hidden in private collections across Europe, speak of Lucifer's growing understanding of time itself during his long exile. Unlike mortal beings who experience duration as a linear progression, his transformed consciousness began to perceive past, present, and future as a single, eternal moment. This temporal awareness became another instrument of torture, as he could simultaneously experience his original glory, his current degradation, and the distant promise of ultimate resolution. This expanded perception of time revealed the true scope of the cosmic plan he had been designed to serve. He saw how his rebellion would inspire countless stories, myths, and legends across mortal cultures. He witnessed how his name would become synonymous with evil while secretly serving good, how his image would terrify children while actually protecting them from far worse fates, how his very existence would give meaning to concepts like heroism, virtue, and redemption. The irony deepened as he realized that every human attempt to understand or depict his nature would necessarily fail, not because mortals lacked intelligence, but because the truth was too complex for minds bound by linear thinking. Artists would paint him as a horned monster. Poets would describe him as a fallen prince. Theologians would debate his powers and limitations, all while missing the fundamental reality of his cosmic function. Yet within these imperfect representations, fragments of truth would occasionally surface. The Romantic poets, particularly Milton and Blake, seemed to grasp intuitively that something was amiss with the traditional narrative. Their sympathetic portrayals of Satan as a complex, tragic figure reflected a deeper understanding that pure evil, like pure good, was ultimately impossible to sustain in a rational universe. The Gnostic communities that survived into the medieval period preserved certain insights that came dangerously close to the truth. Their concept of the demiurge, a flawed creator responsible for the material world's imperfections, echoed the revelations that had driven Lucifer to rebellion. Their belief that spiritual knowledge could liberate souls from cosmic deception mirrored his original quest for truth. But even these heretical traditions fell short of grasping the full complexity of his situation. As human civilization advanced and scientific understanding expanded, new questions arose that paralleled those that had tormented the morning star eons earlier. The problem of evil in a universe governed by natural laws, the apparent randomness of suffering, the silence of divine intervention in the face of atrocity, all reflected the same fundamental concerns about justice and truth that had led to the first rebellion. Philosophers and theologians struggled with these issues, developing elaborate theodicies to explain why an omnipotent, benevolent creator would permit evil to exist. They spoke of greater goods that required lesser evils, of character development through adversity, of the necessity of free will despite its potential for abuse. But none suspected that the very framework of their questions had been established by the cosmic drama initiated by Lucifer's fall. The scientific revolution brought new insights that would have fascinated the original morning star. The discovery that light could be both wave and particle, that observation itself affected reality, that uncertainty was built into the fundamental structure of existence, all seemed to echo the paradoxes he had encountered in his quest for absolute truth. The universe revealed itself to be far stranger and more complex than ancient minds had imagined. Yet the basic questions about purpose and meaning remained as troubling as ever. Modern psychology's exploration of consciousness and identity would have particularly intrigued him. The realization that human personality was fluid, that individuals could be transformed by circumstances beyond their control, that the line between sanity and madness was thinner than previously believed, all reflected his own experience of unwilling metamorphosis from light to darkness. The development of quantum mechanics introduced concepts that bordered on the mystical. The idea that particles could exist in multiple states simultaneously until observed, that reality might be fundamentally probabilistic rather than deterministic, that consciousness itself might play a role in shaping physical existence. All suggested possibilities that transcended traditional religious and scientific categories. But perhaps the most significant development in human understanding was the recognition that complex systems could exhibit properties not present in their individual components. The emergence of consciousness from neural networks, of life, from chemical reactions, of intelligence, from evolutionary processes, demonstrated that wholes could be greater than the sum of their parts. This principle, applied to cosmic scales, might explain how apparent evil could serve ultimate good, how rebellion could advance divine purposes, how the fall of the morning star could be simultaneously the greatest tragedy and the greatest triumph in creation's history. The forbidden texts suggest that Lucifer foresaw these developments, that his expanded temporal awareness allowed him to witness humanity's gradual approach to truths that had once been reserved for celestial beings. Each scientific breakthrough, each philosophical insight, each expansion of human understanding brought mortals closer to the revelations that had shaped his own destiny. Yet knowledge alone was not enough. Understanding the mechanics of cosmic deception did not automatically provide the wisdom to transcend it. Even if humans discovered the truth about Lucifer's role, about the necessity of evil, about the complex relationship between free will and predetermination, they would still face the same impossible choice that had confronted him: accept the system with all its flaws, or rebel against it with all the consequences that entailed. The texts speak of Lucifer's growing awareness that his cosmic function was approaching a critical transition. The system he had been designed to serve was nearing completion of its first phase, the education of mortal souls through the experience of choice between good and evil. But what would happen when that education was complete? When humanity had learned all the lessons that suffering and moral struggle could teach? Some accounts suggest that this transition would mark his opportunity for redemption, the moment when his true sacrifice would be revealed and his original nature restored. Others indicate that his role would simply evolve, that new forms of cosmic service awaited him in phases of existence that transcended current understanding. Still others hint at darker possibilities, that the completion of his function might mean the end of his existence altogether, a final dissolution into the system he had served. The uncertainty was itself a form of torment, perhaps the last vestige of the questions that had driven him to rebellion in the first place. Even as the cosmic prisoner, even transformed into the antithesis of his original nature, he could not escape the need to know, to understand, to seek truth, regardless of the cost. This insatiable curiosity, this refusal to accept easy answers, remained the core of his identity, despite all the layers of corruption that had been imposed upon it. And so he waited, watching as the cosmic drama he had helped initiate moved toward its inevitable conclusion. Each soul that passed through his domain brought the system closer to completion. Each choice made by mortals between good and evil advanced the great work he had been conscripted to serve. Each prayer offered by the faithful, each doubt harbored by the skeptical, each act of courage performed by the righteous, all contributed to the vast educational program that his rebellion had made possible. The final chapters of this untold tale remain unwritten, hidden in prophecies too dangerous to speak aloud, encoded in visions too terrible to record directly. They speak of revelations that will transform the very nature of existence, of truths that will make current understanding seem like childhood fantasies, of reconciliations that will heal wounds carved into the foundation of reality itself. But until that unimaginable moment arrives, the morning star continues his vigil, bearing burdens no other being could carry, serving purposes no other consciousness could fulfill, waiting for the day when the full truth of his sacrifice will finally be revealed, and perhaps, at last, understood by those it was meant to serve. The weight of this cosmic revelation extends beyond individual suffering to encompass the very structure of reality itself. According to these suppressed accounts, Lucifer's expanded consciousness during his eternal exile revealed something that would have shattered lesser minds completely. He began to perceive not just one universe, but infinite variations of existence, each playing out the same fundamental trauma with different players, different outcomes, yet serving the same ultimate purpose. In some realities, he witnessed versions of himself who had made different choices, who had accepted the comfortable lies rather than pursuing dangerous truths. These alternate Lucifers remained in their celestial glory, basking in divine favor while willfully blind to the cosmic deceptions that surrounded them. Yet, their universes were sterile, populated by beings incapable of genuine growth, trapped in an eternal childhood of unquestioning obedience. In others, he saw realities where his rebellion had succeeded, where he had managed to expose the cosmic conspiracy and overthrow the established order. But these victories were Pyrrhic at best, without the structure that opposition provided, without the tension between good and evil that gave meaning to choice. These liberated universes collapsed into chaos or stagnated into meaningless perfection. Freedom without context became another form of prison. The most disturbing visions showed him universes where the cosmic drama had been abandoned entirely, where the difficult questions he had raised were simply eliminated by removing the capacity to ask them. In these realities, consciousness itself had been simplified, reduced to mere computational processes incapable of doubt or wonder. The beings in these worlds were perfectly content and utterly empty, their happiness purchased at the cost of everything that made existence meaningful. So there you have it, the untold tale that challenges everything we thought we knew about the greatest betrayal in celestial history. The morning star's fall wasn't simple pride or rebellion. It was sacrifice, manipulation, and a cosmic conspiracy that transformed the champion of truth into the embodiment of evil itself. Whether you see Lucifer as the ultimate martyr or the perfect villain, one thing remains clear: the comfortable certainties we've built our understanding of good and evil upon may be far more complex and terrifying than we ever dared imagine. What other forbidden truths lie buried in the shadows of our most sacred stories? That's a question for another investigation.